In this world, some forests hold a darkness so deep and quiet it almost feels alive. In the true stillness of night, these woods have claimed lives, while others return from them with haunting, unanswered questions. Did something beyond belief happen to them? In this video, we'll explore 3 heart-stopping horror stories, moments when blood turns cold, shadows come too close, and old beliefs are tested at the edge of terror. Stay with us as we venture into Ghost Hollow, Blackwood, and other haunted woods, where silent howls and looming shadows remind us of the dangers that lurk when night falls. In the small rural town of Millvale, Pennsylvania, people knew to avoid Ghost Hollow after dark. The stories were as old as the town itself, a patch of forest where strange howling sounds echoed at night, and where people had vanished without a trace. The locals whispered about it, sharing tales of shadowy figures and eerie calls that could make even the most courageous men shiver. But Robert and Phil, seasoned hunters and skeptical of all things supernatural, scoffed at these tales. They were looking for a thrill and a bit of adventure, so when they heard about Ghost Hollow, they decided it was just the place to test their nerve. It was late autumn, and the air was brisk, thick with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Armed with flashlights, rifles, and enough supplies for an overnight stay, Robert and Phil set out into Ghost Hollow in the late afternoon, determined to prove that the haunted stories were just local superstition. They joked as they walked, chuckling at the thought of spooking each other with ghost stories. They had hunted in the most remote regions of Pennsylvania, and fear was the last thing on their minds. They set up camp in a small clearing deep in the forest, far away from any trails. As dusk began to fall, they built a fire and prepared a simple meal. The warmth of the fire and the familiar sounds of the forest filled them with a sense of comfort. The usual noises of the woods, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and owls hooting, created a cozy, almost lulling ambiance. As the night deepened, however, an unnatural quiet settled over the forest. The usual sounds seemed to fade, leaving a silence so thick it felt oppressive. Robert and Phil exchanged uneasy glances, both noticing the strange stillness. But before they could comment, a long, mournful howl pierced the air, echoing through the trees. They both froze. The sound was unlike anything they'd heard before. It wasn't the call of a wolf or a coyote, but something deeper, almost human, as if someone were crying out in agony. They tried to laugh it off, blaming the wind or a distant animal, but their laughter sounded forced, hollow. The howl grew louder, almost as if it were moving closer, reverberating through the woods and chilling the air around them. "Must be an echo," Robert muttered, though he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. As if responding to his words, the howling stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence hanging in the air. The sudden quiet felt wrong, as though the forest were holding its breath. A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, making the flames of their campfire flicker wildly. Phil reached for his rifle, instinctively tightening his grip. "You feel that?" he whispered, his eyes scanning the edge of the firelight. Before Robert could respond, he felt a slight pressure, a sensation as if something had brushed past his shoulder. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing, just the shadows cast by the fire, stretching and swaying in the dark. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Phil's face go pale, his eyes wide and fixated on something beyond the firelight. "Phil?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Phil slowly raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the tree line. Do you see that?" Robert followed Phil's gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, just the black shapes of trees against the faint glow of the stars. But then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, he saw it, a tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly still, partially obscured by the trees. It was humanoid, but distorted, as though someone had taken the shape of a person and stretched it, twisted it into something unnatural. Its limbs were too long, its torso hunched, and its head tilted at an odd angle. The darkness seemed to cling to it, obscuring its features, but Robert could feel its eyes on them, piercing, even though he couldn't see them. What is that?" Phil's voice was barely audible, laced with terror. Robert didn't respond. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the figure. It was as if the forest itself was holding him in place, forcing him to stare. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched them, an unmoving shadow in the dark. Finally, Robert snapped out of his trance, his survival instincts kicking in. "We need to leave, now." He grabbed his pack and started to extinguish the fire, his hands shaking as he worked. Phil didn't argue. He gathered his things in a frenzy, his eyes darting nervously toward the edge of the clearing. They set off at a brisk pace, moving away from the clearing and deeper into the forest, hoping to lose whatever it was that had been watching them. But as they walked, the silence grew even heavier, pressing down on them with each step. Robert could feel the figure following them, its presence lingering just beyond his line of sight. Every so often, he would catch a glimpse of it in his peripheral vision, slipping between the trees, always at a distance but always there. Phil's breathing grew ragged as they walked faster, practically jogging through the dark forest, their flashlights casting frantic beams of light. But no matter how fast they moved, the figure kept pace, gliding between the trees as though it were floating. Then the howling began again, louder this time, closer, echoing through the trees with a haunting resonance. The sound was suffused with sorrow and malice, a sound that seemed to reach into their very souls and grip their hearts with icy fingers. "Run!" Robert shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. They broke into a full sprint, dodging branches and leaping over fallen logs, their breaths coming in desperate gasps. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees looming taller, their branches stretching out like twisted claws. As they ran, Robert could feel the presence of the figure growing stronger, as if it were right behind them, reaching out with those elongated arms. He dared not look back, knowing that if he did, he might not be able to keep running. The howling grew louder, more desperate, mingling with the sound of their footsteps. It was as if the entire forest were alive, echoing with the cries of lost souls. Shadows flickered in their path, strange shapes that seemed to move with them, like phantoms watching their escape. Finally, they broke through the tree line, stumbling out onto the road that marked the edge of Ghost Hollow. They collapsed, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from the adrenaline and terror. The howling stopped, the oppressive silence lifting as if a weight had been taken off their shoulders. When they looked back, the forest was still, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The shadowy figure was gone, as if it had never been there. But Robert and Phil knew what they had seen, and the fear lingered, a cold dread that clung to them even as they drove back to town in silence. The next day, they shared their experience with a few of the locals, who nodded knowingly. One of the older men told them they were lucky to have made it out. He spoke of the shadow of Ghost Hollow, an entity that was said to haunt the forest, preying on those who dared to venture too far in after dark. Some said it was the spirit of a man who had once lived there, a hermit shunned by the townsfolk, who had cursed the land with his dying breath. Others claimed it was something far older, a malevolent force tied to the very earth, guarding Ghost Hollow from intruders. Whatever it was, Robert and Phil vowed never to return to Ghost Hollow. The memory of that night haunted them for years, filling their dreams with twisted shadows and mournful howls. They had gone into the forest seeking adventure, but they left with something far darker, a brush with a malevolent presence that would forever remind them of the unexplainable terror that lurked in the heart of Ghost Hollow. Erin had always loved the mountains. She was an experienced hiker who'd traversed some of the most rugged trails across the Appalachian Range. So when she heard about Blackwood Forest, a dense, ancient wood tucked away in the less traveled parts of the Appalachian region, she couldn't resist planning a solo trip. She envisioned peaceful isolation, stunning sunrises, and time alone with nature. Everything she craved. It was early spring, and the forest was waking up from a long winter slumber. A light mist hung over the treetops as Erin set off on her hike that morning, breathing in the fresh, damp air, savoring the earthy smell of moss and wildflowers. The towering trees seemed to welcome her, their trunks covered in greenish lichen, some twisted and ancient as if hiding secrets. Erin felt at home, surrounded by the sounds of the forest. Birds sang overhead, squirrels scampered across the branches, and the soft crunch of leaves under her boots was soothing. By the time she reached her planned campsite, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Erin set up her tent, ate a quick meal, and settled by the campfire, lost in thought. She marveled at how untouched this forest seemed, as if it had been preserved from another era. There were no signs of other campers or hikers. It was exactly what she had wanted, a night alone, with only the wilderness as her companion. As night fell, the temperature dropped. Erin huddled closer to the fire, feeling the warmth chase away the chill. It was around this time she noticed a peculiar sensation, a prickling at the back of her neck. She brushed it off as her mind playing tricks on her. It wasn't unusual to feel a little uneasy when alone in the dark. But as the minutes passed, the sensation grew more intense, a feeling of eyes on her, following her every movement. She shrugged it off, focusing on the sounds of the forest around her, the owls calling, the wind rustling the leaves. But every now and then, her eyes darted to the edge of the firelight, half expecting to see something there, watching. As she put out the fire and settled into her tent, she told herself she was just being paranoid. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at her, making her feel vulnerable and exposed. She zipped up her sleeping bag and lay still, listening to the sounds outside, hoping sleep would come soon. Around midnight, she heard it, the distinct crunch of footsteps on dry leaves just outside her tent. Her heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling around her tent. She tightened her grip on her flashlight, reasoning that it was probably a curious animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. She waited, hoping it would go away, but the footsteps continued, moving slowly around her tent, stopping briefly before resuming their cautious, unhurried path. Her pulse quickened. Animals usually scurried away at the first sign of a human, yet whatever this was seemed unbothered, as if it were studying her, lingering on purpose. Erin took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She'd dealt with bears before. She knew how to handle herself in the wilderness. Mustering her courage, she unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside and shined her flashlight into the dark. Her light revealed only shadows, stretching out across the trees, twisting in strange patterns as she moved her hand. She strained her eyes, trying to pierce the darkness. Then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of her flashlight, a silhouette so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure was tall, far taller than any person she'd ever seen, with an elongated form that was both humanoid and somehow wrong, as if it didn't quite belong. Erin's breath caught in her throat. The shadowy figure didn't move. It had no discernible features, no face, no eyes, just a void-like presence watching her. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay still, her hand frozen on the zipper. She felt as though if she moved, if she made a sound, it would come closer. After what felt like an eternity, the figure took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Erin scrambled backward, nearly falling over as she zipped up the tent, her hands shaking. She tried to steady her breath, tried to reason with herself, but the fear was overpowering. She could still hear the footsteps, moving around her tent, slow and heavy, as if it were savoring each step. Huddled in her sleeping bag, she could feel the shadow's presence, lurking just outside the thin nylon walls of her tent. It felt as if it was pressing in on her, suffocating her with a darkness that was deeper than the night itself. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream, hoping, praying that whatever it was would lose interest and go away. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the footsteps faded, dissolving into the distant sounds of the forest. But Erin knew better than to let her guard down. She stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching her flashlight, listening for any sign of the figure's return. She felt trapped, each minute stretching on in agonizing silence, punctuated by the occasional rustle or snap from the woods. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees, she wasted no time. She packed her gear in record time, her eyes darting to the edge of the campsite, half expecting the shadow to emerge from behind a tree. But the forest was still, peaceful even, as if the events of the night had been nothing but a bad dream. With her backpack secured, she took one last look at the clearing, her heart racing, and turned to leave. She hiked out of Blackwood Forest without stopping, glancing over her shoulder every few minutes, certain that the shadow was watching her, following her just out of sight. When she finally emerged from the forest, she felt a weight lift, a sense of relief washing over her. But the memory of the shadow lingered. For weeks after, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of seeing shadows move just beyond her field of vision. She even researched local lore, hoping to find a logical explanation for what she had experienced. Erin soon discovered that she was not alone. Locals referred to it as the Shadow of Blackwood. Hikers and campers had reported strange sightings of a tall, faceless figure lurking in the woods, watching them, following them in silence. The shadow was said to appear to those who ventured too deep into the forest, a guardian or perhaps a cursed spirit, tied to the land for reasons unknown. To this day, Erin refuses to hike in Blackwood Forest. She's tried to rationalize her experience, telling herself it was just her imagination or a trick of the light. But deep down, she knows what she saw was real, that something ancient and malevolent lurks in the depths of Blackwood, waiting for the next lone traveler who dares to tread too far into its domain. It was the summer of 1998 when a group of friends, Chris, Ashley, Ben, and Lisa, planned a camping trip deep within the ancient redwood forest of California. With their last semester of college on the horizon, they wanted one last adventure together, something to remember before they were swept up by the real world. They planned to spend 3 nights in the forest, surrounded by the towering trees and starlit skies, with nothing but tents, flashlights, and a cooler full of essentials. The first night went as expected. They pitched their tents, lit a fire, and spent hours talking about their college experiences, laughing, and sharing their dreams for the future. As the fire crackled, Chris mentioned an old story he'd heard about the redwood forest. He said that some campers and hikers had reported hearing voices late at night, echoing through the trees, whispering things in languages no one understood. Ashley and Lisa dismissed it as a ghost story, but Ben, the most skeptical of the group, couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine. The next day, they spent hours hiking and taking in the vast, serene beauty of the redwoods. Each tree seemed to touch the sky, their roots twisting and intertwining with the forest floor like ancient fingers clinging to the earth. The air was fresh and smelled of damp moss and pine. It was peaceful, and all thoughts of Chris's ghost story vanished under the grandeur of the woods. When night fell on the second evening, they returned to camp, exhausted yet content. They cooked a simple meal over the fire and settled in to watch the flames dance. It was around midnight when they first heard it, a faint whisper floating through the trees. At first, they barely noticed it, thinking it was the wind rustling through the leaves. But the sound persisted, faint yet distinct, as if someone was muttering just out of earshot. They paused, listening. It was a low, hushed mumbling, almost like a chant, too soft to make out any words. Ben chuckled nervously, claiming it was just the wind, but Chris, who had been silent since they heard the whispers, wasn't so sure. He decided to call out, half joking, "Hello? Anyone out there?" The others laughed, but their laughter quickly died when the forest went eerily silent. The wind stopped, the leaves stilled, and even the crackling of their fire seemed to dim. They looked around, exchanging uneasy glances. Then the whispering resumed, louder this time, and chillingly clear, coming from directly behind them. Chris, determined to see if someone was playing a prank, turned around with his flashlight, scanning the dark, towering shadows cast by the trees. But there was nothing, just empty forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. "Maybe it's just an echo," Ashley whispered, though her voice betrayed her fear. The whispering grew louder, closer, wrapping around them like an invisible presence circling their camp. The whispers seemed to rise and fall in intensity, and as they grew louder, they took on a different tone, a pleading, desperate sound, like someone begging. Each whisper sounded as if it were coming from a different direction, as though dozens of voices were surrounding them, closing in. Panicking, Ben doused the fire, plunging their camp into darkness, hoping it might discourage whoever or whatever was causing the voices. They quickly packed up what they could carry, deciding to abandon camp and hike back to the car, even though it meant a grueling, disorienting walk through the dark forest. They hadn't gone far when the whispering followed, echoing through the trees, but this time it felt closer, more intimate. It was as if the whispers were in their ears, hot breath brushing against their necks, even though no one was near them. Chris could feel it. He swore he could feel someone right next to him, whispering in a voice so low, so broken, that it sent chills through his entire body. Half running now, they clutched their flashlights, aiming their beams in every direction. Shadows seemed to move around them, flickering in and out of view, like figures lurking just outside the reach of their lights. Every few steps, they would catch a glimpse of something, a fleeting movement, a face in the dark, or the glint of eyes watching them. "Keep moving," Chris urged, his voice trembling. He didn't dare tell the others, but he could hear something behind him, footsteps mirroring his own, crunching on twigs and leaves, coming closer and closer. They stumbled through the forest, tripping over roots and rocks, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers turned into anguished cries, a cacophony of voices as if the trees themselves were alive and pleading for release. One voice, louder than the rest, seemed to call out Chris's name. "Chris! Chris!" it hissed, stretching the syllables into a sinister, drawn-out sound. He froze, fear paralyzing him as he realized the voice was familiar. Familiar yet wrong, like someone imitating a voice he knew well. It sounded like his late grandfather, who had passed away years ago. Chris broke into a run, urging the others to keep moving. As they neared the edge of the forest, the whispers grew softer, as if reluctant to let them go. The voices faded into the background, blending with the rustling leaves and distant chirping of night creatures, until there was nothing left but silence. When they finally reached their car, they collapsed inside, trembling and pale, locking the doors as though that could somehow protect them. Chris looked out at the trees, half expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, watching them. But there was nothing, only the still, silent forest, as if the whispers had never existed. They drove back to the nearest town without looking back, never speaking of what they had heard. To this day, Chris and his friends refuse to go camping, especially in the redwoods. Chris often dreams of that night, of the whispers, of the voice calling his name in the dark. And every time he tries to recall it, he feels that same cold, unsettling feeling, like someone is still out there, whispering, waiting for him to return.